Is there anyone here who hasn't set this up, who's willing to share their screen?
So what do you mean by, okay, I'm just going to go with Glenn.
Okay. Okay. So
I raised my hand too fast.
So if you'd like to share your screen, we'll go through the process, and if everyone else can follow along, and I'm kind of hoping this worked. I mentioned to Gwen that when we did this in the fall, there was a little bit of a glitch. It didn't quite work for everybody, but we're going to go through the process of setting up an account, and then we'll go through the process of using it once we get to that stage. So the first thing you do, if you have an account set up, you would sign in as an instructor. So click on that. And then if you have the account set up, you would then log into it. If you don't have the account set up, you would then click on the create account. And so if you have an account, so if you've used iClicker with reef polling in the past with the physical clickers, you have an account, just log into that. If you have not used iClicker with a mobile app, then you have to create the account and use your Oswego email address for this. Okay. Okay. So let's let everyone get to the stage. Gwen already has an account created. So it'll ask you questions like find your institution, then you put in your first name, your last name, your email, and you create a password, the usual types of things. So does everyone either have an account or got to the screen where you create an account? Yes. Okay. So then once you're at the stage where it says you do not have any active courses, everyone at that? Okay. What you would do is you would click create a new course. And then you have two options, full course or attendance only. I would really suggest you do the full course, even if you're only going to use it occasionally. Attendance only just would require students to, well, for the college to pay $4 per student just so that you can take attendance. And that's generally not seen as a really good practice. It's especially a bad practice if you make students pay like $40 or $50 for a device that you're only using to track if they're there. There's no learning gains from that, and it just pisses people off that you're making us pay for connecting. Okay. And I see we have Nick is here.
Sorry about that, guys. Thank you. Good morning.
Hi. So we already started. We're just a little ways into this. What you need to do is do a search on your browser for iClicker Cloud. And then once you get there, do you have an account already?
I had one.
Okay. So then you'd have the option of logging into that. And if you forget your password, you could, reset it. So if you used iClicker with mobile devices in the past, you'll have an account. So, and for everyone else, we're now at the screen where you first pick your institution, you pick your discipline, so it will show up there for students to find your classes, and then you would type in a name of the class, something that would be easy to find. And then just so you don't get a whole mess of things up there, put in the starting dates and the ending dates. The defaults are probably fine, unless you want to make sure it terminates a little bit easier. So you could go through and pick the actual beginning and ending dates, and that's when students will have access to this for use. And now you could allow students to search for and self-enroll. I think that actually happens for them, but I'm not positive. Now, the rest of this is optional. It's the same sort of setup that we had before for reef polling for students who are using a mobile app in the iClicker Classic. It's the same data that goes into the same database, but you would type in the short ID for the class, which if they were using a physical clicker would show up there. It would show up on also the screen. You don't have to do this, but we'd often put in, say, history and then the number, or echo and the number, or chemistry and the number, et cetera. And putting in the term makes it easier for us and for students to keep track of when they had it, because students can always go back and look at their grade history and so forth. So it's convenient to do that. And again, the rest is optional, but you might want to put in the times, that's up to you. And just enter the starting times for the classes. I usually do it just to make sure that students don't sign up for the wrong section if they were selecting the course, if I have multiple sections. Eleven 10:55, right? Okay, or you could just leave it optional. And once you have that, I think if you scroll down, oh, you have the option now of create. And in fact, you could just click Tuesday, Thursday if you want to, but it doesn't matter. You can always go back and change that later too. Oh, I guess you do have to put in the time if you're going to put in the, yeah. So, okay. So that's optional. It doesn't really matter in any way other than it's listed there for students to identify it. So then just create the course. Okay. And now if you click on the course name, okay. Now, if you click on gradebook, this is where we do the connection to Blackboard, I think. Okay, so click on the setting up integrations. Okay, now we need to connect to Blackboard. Click on that and then click go to Blackboard. And this should open an instance of Blackboard that you log into. And you just log in as you normally would in your Blackboard course. Oh, I'm sorry. Click on sign in with third-party account, and then you just use your short one because I don't think that other will work. Use the SAML, sorry. Okay, and now you would pick your, right. Is everyone seeing the same sort of screen? Now, here's where, if you click on unpublished classes, your current classes are probably not published yet, but if you select unpublished, you'll probably be able to see it. Up at the very top of the screen, you notice the published classes are the ones that are out there that are visible. If you want to connect to a class that is not yet open to students, click on unpublished at the top right. Oh, you've already opened it? Okay. So never mind. If you haven't opened your class yet to students, then click on unpublish and you should be able to see it. Okay. And then once you've selected the course, now the next step is to sync the roster. This is working much better it did than when we tried this back in August. Okay, so there's 6 students in Blackboard who are not yet in your class, and well, we won't view the details, but it would list all those students and give you an option of sending an email to them with instructions. I guess that probably wouldn't be FERPA. Would that be a FERPA violation to see those students' names?
I don't think so. I mean, all it tells you is that they're taking my class.
Right, and okay, so click on that.
Which one? View details?
Yes, view details. And then if you click on the box to the left of name, what it will do is if you click send email, it will send them the link to connect to the course and for them to download the app and to create their own account if they don't already have one. And you have to let them know you're not a robot.
John,
Yes.
when, if students are going to add and drop, so a new student adds and doesn't have an
It's
iClicker
all done
account?
automatically. What will happen is when you go to sync the roster, it will tell you that these students have added have been added to your roster? Do you want to add them to iClicker? Just say yes, and it will automatically add them. And if students drop, it will say, these students have dropped your course. Do you want to remove them from the gradebook? Just say yes. And every time you do it for the first couple of weeks, that will be happening as students come in or leave your course. And then eventually it'll settle down unless someone withdraws later.
So we will need to resync periodically the first couple weeks.
At least for the first couple of weeks. Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, what I got, John, here is I sent that email to 8 of my students who needed to receive it. And now I have another window that says there are 8 students from Blackboard are pending and need to enroll in your iClicker course. We didn't find iClicker accounts for these students.
So that
Send
probably,
students an email with instructions to enroll. Is it like, why does it do it 2 times?
my guess is probably some of the students had used iClicker in a previous class and the others need to create an account. So if students have not used iClicker before, they have to create an account. If they have used iClicker before, they just need to enroll in your class, you see?
Okay.
So just say in both cases, view details and send it. Okay, so in your case, in Gwen's case, 6 students now are already enrolled in iClicker and have it. So if you want to, you could send it to them too. It's the same issue.
It won't allow it. I tried it. One email in 24 hours. Pretty smart.
Huh, interesting. Okay. So maybe, okay. I'm not sure why it's doing that twice, but maybe was it a duplicate, possibly the same students? If it was the same students, then that's not an issue.
It was the same students for me.
Okay, so yeah, if it's the same students, that's just saying they're not yet there. And then from then on, it will give you that reminder that there are students in your roster who have not yet joined iClicker. And you can remind them, send them an email. You know, I had about 189 students at the start of the semester, and there were 2 or 3 students who took like 2 or 3 weeks to join. You know, so I was doing that every time I uploaded grades for like 4 or 5 sessions of the class, and I would just send them a reminder that they have not yet connected. So they're not able to participate in the polls until then. And then click close, and now all the students in your class will have received invitations. And now you can choose the column name that you're going to use, okay? Well, if you just scroll down a little bit, you have choices there. You could either have one column for all of your grades for the whole semester, or individual columns for every class day. Most people will tend to choose a second option. So that way, instead of having just a cumulative score, students can see what the scores were on each day and so forth. That's probably the most flexible way of doing it. You know, unless you only want one score showing up, which is their cumulative iClicker score, they can still see the individual days in the iClicker app by looking at their gradebook. But if you want the Blackboard gradebook to show separate scores for each day, choose the individual activity scores, and then a new score is created for each day's worth of activity. Okay.
So John, if you're not using it for quizzing, is there a way to just ignore this, just hit cancel up top? Because I only want to use it for polling, not grade, not score credit based.
Then in that case, you don't even
Okay.
need to connect it to the gradebook. But some people who do that will just do polling, but we'll still use an attendance score. We'll still use it for attendance purposes, basically where you can assign a participation score. That comes back when we do the setting up the course in terms of how the scores are set. So if you want to do it just so that they can see when they attended and give them credit for just physically participating in a poll, regardless of what answers they chose, then you can still do it this way. But well, you still have the option of either choosing one overall score or separate ones, but it would be based not on how they answered, but whether they participated or not. So that's up to you. Do you want to have a record of whether they participated or not in the gradebook? You could always assign a weight of 0 to it. So you can still have the columns, but not put any weight in it, just so they could see where they participated and where they didn't, if you choose to. Okay, so in other words, you can skip all of this, everything about the Blackboard integration, if you don't want scores in Blackboard. Then they'd only show up in the app. But the other thing is, then you wouldn't be able to get the notification of students adding or dropping. So there's some advantage to doing the notification, even if you're not going to do it. But if you don't want to keep the scores in any way, you might just want to have the total combined score, and then you could hide that column in Blackboard so it wouldn't show up, but it would still give you the integration. That's probably what I would do in that case.
I like
Okay.
that last one. Yeah, thanks, John.
Because then you only have to hide the one column instead of a new one each time.
I was thinking about the same way that Jim was, so I'm actually gonna switch back.
Yeah, so just create the one column then, and then hide it. So it won't be visible to students, but it would still be visible to you, so you could see whether they participated or not. Now, the next question is, if students did not respond, do you want to upload a grade of 0 or just leave it a blank? I usually assign a grade of 0, just because it makes a gradebook more complete, because I do use scoring. They're low stakes and they get some points for answering, regardless of how they answer. But it's up to you, but every time you upload it, we'll replace it. So if for some reason they weren't synced correctly, a common thing that will happen let me rephrase it. It used to be really common when students had to enter the tiny little print ID number on the back of their physical clickers, that they confuse a B and an 8 or the letter O with the number 0, and then their grades wouldn't be syncing. It ties everything to their account, but with this, it's far less likely that that will happen. The only time when there's any type of an error is if students either don't select your class, or they select the wrong class, or they're trying to participate, but they're not. Generally, the problems are far less common, given that students connect directly to your class when they first create their account, or when they first open the app. So if you want to treat missing scores as zeros, if you're not going to use it for a grade and it's going to be hidden, it doesn't matter which you choose. But if you do want to give them scores, either based on participation or how they responded, you probably want to set it to receive a score of 0 if they don't participate. So that's up to you, right? Okay. Now, let's go through each of these items at the top. Course details you already set up. And that's where you can change it if you want to add times or whatever. If you want to add more detail, choose devices next. And here you're going to choose how you're going to let students participate. My recommendation for the spring, at least, is that you choose mobile devices only, because unless you strongly do not want to have students using mobile devices in the class. If you choose mobile devices only, it will be completely free for students if they're using an iPhone, an Android phone, a Chromebook, or a laptop, or any other tablet. As long as they have a web-connected device, they're able to participate. If you want to use iClicker remotes, a couple of things happen. One is that students have to buy them. And, if we were in a situation where lots of students had old ones, then that might be a good option if you're going to restrict yourself to multiple choice. But by allowing either iClicker remotes or the mobile devices and iClicker remotes, you first restrict your question types to only mobile device, to only multiple choice. And secondly, students have to physically buy the mobile device, and there has to be a base station in your classroom. So is there anyone who wants to not allow students to use mobile devices? Okay, so choose mobile devices only. Okay, and now this is a beta item here. I haven't used it, but you might want to try it. if you're going to be using it for grading in particular, you could use it to check student focus to see if they're switching from one app to another. It tells you what proportion of the time students are not focused on the participation thing, and to what extent they're in other windows on the app or in other windows on the browser. I haven't done that. Partly because I probably don't want to know, but if you want to play with it, you can, and it gives students feedback on that, telling them how well focused they were and to what extent they were being distracted by using other things in their mobile device. So,
Quick question. Well, if they switch between, let's say, PowerPoint and like a Blackboard file there for that, and this software, would that be reflected?
on a mobile device, it would show them as switching back and forth because they have to leave the app to go into PowerPoint and so forth. So in practice, if you're in a classroom, most people would be watching whatever you're doing up front, whatever presentation you're doing. So they wouldn't have another app open. So they'd be seeing physically in a classroom, they'd be seeing your PowerPoint or slides up on the screen. And so this would basically just say, are they closing the window that has the questions you're going to be asking them to browse the web or to watch videos or to play games or to order something or to, check Instagram or whatever. So it's basically them switching to some other task while they're in class. That's up to you whether you want to do that or not. You'll get the report after each session of what proportion of the times they stayed on the app and what proportion of the time they were elsewhere, as will all the students. I haven't tried it, so I can't really say much about it, but it is an option that was enabled this fall. So that's up, if you want to try it, you can. I think you can toggle it on and off later. I don't think it's locked in. So if you want to try it for a day or two, do it. And if it gets annoying, turn it off.
It might be too many emails.
There might be, well, I think it's just a report that you see when you do the upload at the end and so forth. So I don't think it'll be emails so much as students would see it when they log in and you'd see it when you log into the gradebook synchronization. Okay, so now the next thing is attendance. And this gives students a reminder and you as well about students who miss some of the settings, some of the sessions with your class. So what you could do basically is if you want to give students a warning, if they miss more than a certain number of questions, you could just click on that box and type in whatever number you choose. So they get a warning about this. And you could have it automatically run that between the hours when your class is in session or at certain times during that. The next thing, and this has moved from beta to it looks like actual real-time attendance, is you can require and set location for attendance. So that does some geolocation-based attendance. And to be honest, I haven't tried this. I'd be a little hesitant about it simply because if they log in and they're connected through if they're connected to the campus Wi-Fi, I'm not sure where that attendance, where the point of attendance would be set. If they're on a mobile device, it probably would be set to the GPS coordinates, but I'm not sure where the instructor's account would show up. And if it's based on the location of the network or how that's set. If it's your own computer and you're connected to wireless, it's going to be picking it up from the, from your wireless connection, I suppose, but I'm not sure how wide of an area this uses. If you're welcome to try it, but my only caution with this is, well, two cautions. One is if this works well, it's going to prevent students who are in quarantine or who are attending remotely for some other reason from being able to participate or being counted as being in attendance. And the other thing is, if you're, depending on where they're connected, I'm not sure what the distance is from your specific location or even exactly how that's determined. So what I'm saying is, try this, but it will preclude people from attending remotely, and it might block some people that you don't intend to block, depending on how the GPS coordinates are being set. The simplest thing, if you want to use attendance, is that box that is checked by default, which is they're marked as attending whenever they answer any question at all while the attendance is running, and you set the times when it runs up above. So if they answer any question during the class times, they're marked as attending, basically.
Is the attendance recorded in Blackboard?
It is not recorded in Blackboard. It's recorded in the iClicker instructor and the iClicker student apps.
So this would be redundant if you're using the attendance feature in Blackboard.
If you're using participation points or the participation score in Blackboard, it would be redundant. And so I haven't really used this. I did set it up just so that they get a warning if they miss more than 3 classes, I think I said, just so that they're reminded that they're supposed to be using this when they do connect, saying, well, you've missed this many, and so forth. It's not essential, and you get the same information from the grades, actually, or from their participation scores.
So John, this last thing says an iClicker remote. Is that physical remote? They're
That
not
would be the
using
physical
mobile phone?
clicker. Yes.
Okay, so if we chose mobile only, we would
So
uncheck
you're right.
this.
That does not matter. Right. I'm sorry. I should have read all of that. That's only if they're using a physical clicker, so that wouldn't matter. The reason why that's there is that if you are using physical clickers, there's no GPS location on them. Other than that, you're within a couple hundred meters of the base station, basically, in the classroom. So the only way you'd be able to check for attendance with people using physical clickers, if that was enabled, was by their answers. So never mind. The others, it's basically whether they answer questions within that time period or whether they're logged into the app. But I get all that information just from the polling scores. So now so you can unclick that, and whether you require a location for attendance or require and set it, that's up to you. It basically chooses whatever is there. Now let's go to the polling. That's where the more useful things are. Now, what I generally do is automatically let them see what's on the screen, because if you do have students attending remotely, or if we have to go remote, some students will be both participating in Zoom and participating in the poll from a mobile device. And if they're on a computer and use a mobile device, there's no problem, because they can see the questions on the Zoom screen and then they'd be able to answer on the mobile device. But if they are toggling between iClicker and Zoom on their mobile devices, they'd have to remember what the answer was when they switched over if you don't share the screen. So it's probably much easier if you just choose automatically share your screen when polling starts. The only time I suppose you might want to block that is if you only want students who are physically in a room to be able to see what the question is, which again would mean that students couldn't participate remotely. Given the circumstances we're in, where we're likely to have students out for any number of reasons, especially in the early part of the semester where COVID is still, relatively frequent, it might be better just to automatically share it and not worry about it. When polling ends, then they only see the question on their device after the poll ends, which wouldn't be that helpful. You could choose to not send a picture, and then they just get the answer box, basically, where they see the list of A, B, C, D, or E for multiple choice, or they'd see true, false, whatever the option is for whatever the options are that you set, they'd see. Okay, but they wouldn't see the actual text. Now, for the next one, I use the method that Eric Missouri used, where you poll students once for questions where there is a correct answer anyway, where you poll students once, and then you look at the results, and then you let students discuss it, and then you let them vote again. if you want to do that, you don't want students to see what the initial poll results were before they discuss it and before they, go through this peer instruction stage where they're making the case for why they chose the answer they did and listening to other people explain why they chose other answers. So I would generally suggest you don't send the results when polling ends. Instead, you just discuss it. Once you got to the stage where you finish it, you could share it on your screen. And if students are in Zoom, they'd see the results and the breakdown. So that's up to you. If you're only going to do a poll once, you could automatically let them see what the results are when the poll ends. But if you want to do that sort of two-stage things where they vote individually, they engage in peer discussion and they vote again, don't send the results because that's going to bias their discussion and they'll tend to just converge to whatever was the most popular answer the first time. Okay, now below is where you choose how people are going to be graded. There's two possible ways of doing it in any combination. You could have, as before, you could have session participant, you could have scores based just on participation, regardless of what they choose, or you could have scores based on their specific answers. And you can always do a mix by choosing anonymous to where there are no scores. So, so here, what would happen is you would choose a criteria for participation. And if you could just show those options again, Gwen, if you could just click on that drop down one more time, the drop down there. So you could require them to get participation by answering every question you post, all but one, at least 3/4 of them, at least half, or at least one question. So depends on how generous you want to be in terms of the grade. Now, if you're only going to ask one question, it doesn't matter which of those you pick, because they'd all be equivalent. But if you're going to have multiple questions, you might allow them to miss one, or if they come in late, or if they have to leave early, or if they have some type of problem where they get distracted. That's up to you. But you can choose what the basis of the points are if you're just grading it based on their participation in the poll. Okay, and that's pretty much, if you've used iClicker before, these are the same options you had before with that. Okay, and now if instead you want to score individual questions when there is a correct answer, you have the same basis that we did before, where you have some points for responding. By default, it's 0, and then 1 point for a correct answer. What I've normally done, and I know a lot of people have done, is some people, I usually give 3 points for responding. So I'd put in a 3 there. And then for a correct answer, I'd put in 2. And what that would do is the points for a correct response are those added on to the points for responding. So students would get 5 points if they answer it correctly, 3 points for just attempting the question. It's really low stakes. And altogether, I think I usually let them be worth 10% of the total grade. So any one class is just a tiny fraction of the total. But you can leave that blank, leave it at 0 if you're only doing participation, or you could put in your base score for responding as the points for responding, and then the points for correct response would be the additional points. And then, and that's pretty much all you need to do. Now, you also have the option of just score the total participation, where you have a maximum number of points possible. Even though there's individual questions, there's a maximum number of points that will cap out. That's very rarely used, but it's a new feature in case you want to set it so that the maximum number of points people could get would be, say, 10 points or something like that. That's rarely used in practice. Most people use either participation or polling, or even a combination where people use some points for just being there, some points for each question, and some points for correct answers. And most people, though, either use participation points or scoring individual questions.
John,
Does that
the total, when you select the option scoring total polling session, if we set the total points per polling session to 5 and I ask 3 questions, does that automatically divide up that 5 points?
Yes,
so each
it would. So it would be tied to that proportion, right? So that means if one day you happen to ask 10 questions ask 10 questions, another day you ask 2, the total would be 5. So it caps, well, yeah, you're right. It's setting a fixed number of points per day rather than a fixed number of points per question.
Okay, but the questions are still going to get graded individually.
You're right. You're right. I
It's
haven't
just-
used it, so I was incorrect with my first statement about it. It's not just capping the points, it's dividing the points up proportionately depending on how you set it.
Right, so my question there would be if I select that versus the individual poll questions in Blackboard, if I have score individual poll questions, am I going to get a different score for each question in Blackboard?
You get one total score for the day, but if one day you, let's say, suppose you make correct answers 5 points. If you one day you have 3 questions, the maximum score for the day would be 15. If
Okay.
another day you ask 10 questions, the maximum score for that day would be 50. So what would happen then is some days would count more than others depending on how many questions you have. But if you set the total polling session as a fixed score, it's going to divide it among those. So
Okay.
it's a question of whether you want each question to count the same or each day to count the same, basically. So if you want each day to have the same weight in that total, if you're just using the sum of the columns in that category, then you would choose that option. If you want it to be based on, if you want to have different days with different weights, depending on how many questions, potentially, then you would do this. But again, you could also set it up in Blackboard to do the same thing, where either it's a weighted sum or just a, just a total column.
One other thing, and I apologize, I know it's a few minutes late.
Oh, that's fine.
The lecture computers,
They all have this
are they all
installed.
equipped with this? Okay.
They are, and it's right on the desktop. And there was an interesting problem when it was first set up because there was no way of setting it up for multiple users. So what happens actually is that when you click on it, it downloads the program and it only takes a couple of seconds. And then you log into the newly downloaded program. They did a really nice job of setting it up. So it looks like you're just logging into it, but you click on it, it downloads it, you log in, and then it's all ready to go. And we'll go over that in just in a little bit. So it should be on all the desktop machines. Now, the next question is, if you're going to give questions, do you want to use a count up or count down? A count up means you have to cut off polling. In a large class where I have numeric responses or multiple choice questions, I've generally used a countdown where I'll start it typically at 1.5 minutes the first week or so, and then cut it down to maybe 1.25 minutes, maybe even a minute if students are responding pretty quickly. The countdown tends to force students to be a little more rapid in opening the app and responding. If you use a count up, it's going to take a much longer time on average for students to get around to opening the app, responding to the question, and so forth. It depends on how often you're going to do this. If you're using free response questions where they're going to type text, you probably want to use the count up and just give students as much time as they need. And you'll see a count of the number of questions that come in, and you could give them a warning, say, I'm going to cut this off in 30 seconds, and then cut it off at that point. But if you're doing multiple choice and numeric response questions, what I normally do is use a fixed countdown timer with a fixed number of seconds, but I give them time with the question displayed before I start the polling. So if the question is a pretty simple one, I'll just open the poll as soon as the question becomes visible. If it's one where they have to do some calculations, they have to do more work to get to a response, I'll let them look at it and work through it for a bit before I start the polling. But that way, at least they know how much time they have to answer, so it's up to you. I would probably set it maybe 1.5 minutes at first until students get used to it. You can always adjust it later, and you can adjust it in the app too. If students are having problems, often in the past, it hasn't happened too much recently, but when I was teaching in Lanigan, students would often have trouble if I had 300 or 400 students connecting to Wi-Fi. So even though I asked them to start the app when the class started, some of them wouldn't, and they'd only start at the end, and then they'd have network connection issues. So I just bump up the timer while it's running until everyone could connect. And so try it and see if you need more or less time, you can change it. If you decide to do the count up, you can always switch this later and it will change the default for the class. Okay, and you can change it manually within the app, but once you change it for the class, that's the default whenever you start this. Okay, these are the main things. The quizzing is only if you're going to set up a quiz where you have multiple questions put together as a quiz from within the app. And so, for example, you could use that asynchronously, or you could do it instead of just having a poll where everyone's answering one question, you could put all your questions together and open a quiz where students would log in, and then they'd have to answer all the questions. Some people have used that at the start of class to do a quick quiz on things they've done, you know, something they were supposed to read before or something similar, or a video they watched or something outside of class. So you could ask multiple questions here, but you could do the same thing in Blackboard, you know, either before class or during class. So quizzing is probably not used that often, but it does give you the option of asking multiple questions all at once, but then you have to set up the quiz questions within the app rather than doing it on your slides. Okay, so that's pretty much all set up now. So the integration is what was already done with the integration with Blackboard. You can click on it, but that's that integration. Now, the name of it, you could change to whatever you'd like. It could be iClicker grade, it could be polling scores, or if you're going to hide it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yes.
I clicked on course details here, and now it shows, you know, attendance only, free for students. Full course, it doesn't say that. Is that an issue?
Glenn, could you click on that? It should be free for students. Oh, okay, yes. This is the basic settings. Because Oswego has a site license for this, it's going to be free in both cases.
Okay, got it.
So
Thanks.
in other words, if you were using it only for attendance with only the mobile app, that is free, even if we weren't paying for it. Okay, it's a way of sucking faculty into this. But because we have a site license, it's going to be free at any time. And when I said before about, you know, it's probably best not to use it because you have to pay, that would be if that was more of an issue with the old mobile devices, because there were a few instructors on campus who had students pay between $20 and $45 to buy a clicker, and they only used it to take attendance. And, you know, again, there's no real learning gains from that. And students weren't generally happy with paying for a device just so instructors could see who was there. You know, they'd rather have you just pass around a sheet of paper or do something similar rather than make you pay something that you weren't actually going to use in the class for any learning purposes. So, okay, so it's all set up now. So now the next thing is to download. Yeah, so you can click save and that class is all set up and ready to go. And the next thing you would do is, if you want to practice with this, what you would do is you could run it from here, but what you probably would want to do is click on that link to download the iClicker Cloud desktop app just to practice this. But one concern, yeah, so choose Windows or Mac, whichever version you've had, and then it should be able to install, okay? Most of us will have administrative privileges. If not, there is a version that'll work without it, but it's better to install the full version. And then I'm not sure what all that is, but you should see, I'm not seeing it download.
That makes two of us.
Oh,
I'm now not signed in again.
Okay, I don't know if maybe you need to be. Try that. Try signing in. But it looks like that's giving you instructions rather than actually downloading.
John, while she's figuring that out, attendance. If we don't have a location set up, can students sign in during your class from their dorm room?
Yes, they could, which is why they put in the geolocation.
Okay. I mean, because the only reason I take attendance is because the college tells me to. I don't have attendance as a grade, but the college tells me to in case there's a legal thing or whatever. I got to take attendance. So it doesn't really work unless you use the geo thing, right?
Well, or unless unless you turn off the display the question thing and you have questions in class that they can only see on the screen, although they could still access that if you don't turn on the geo fencing. So yeah, it's possible that students could be marked as attending, even though they're not physically there, and they might not even be in the Zoom session. So you may want to try that. And if you do, let me know how it works. I allowed students to attend remotely just because in the class at large, I always had at least 15 to 20 students with various legitimate reasons for being out, especially at the start of the fall semester. Okay, maybe if you click, well, there should be a download link.
Oh, I know. But it's back to, I'm not
Maybe-
even logged in anymore.
Maybe if you click on the tab to the left of it, the iClicker one.
You can download it without being logged in.
Oh, okay, yeah. So click on downloads again, and maybe click on downloads on this menu,
Thank you, Nick.
and click on the download options. Yeah, and this should allow you to download it.
It's right back to the beginning.
Yes, and there it goes though. This time it's working. Okay. It just takes a minute or two to download typically. And once it's downloaded, you could just go to your download folder and click next. And it asks you whether you want notifications about mandatory or optional downloads. That's the default. I'd leave that so that if there's a new version with new features or bug fixes, it'll remind you to install it. Okay. Now, what will happen is if you use this right now, it's going to mess up a little bit because it's going to show that is your first class session. And then anyone who tries it will get a message saying that they missed the class already. What you may want to do, and this is something I learned last fall when I tried it twice before my class, and students were told that they had 2 absences right on the very first day of the class when we first started using it. You may want to create a dummy course just for you to practice with. So if you go back to the settings, maybe on that other tab, what I'd suggest doing is going back to, see if you have a drop down right there, see if there's an option to create a new course. Yeah, create a new course. And what I would suggest doing is just create, just call it demo or test or practice or whatever. You could pick any discipline too if you want. You could be in pharmacy or in veterinary medicine, and just, yeah.
Where do we go to? I'm
right up at the top. You should have an option. If it's not right where you have the course, just choose the option to create a new course. And then what I would suggest is now log into your app now that you've got this fake class. So now open your app, which should be in your start menu now. There it is. And now you'll have to log in. And this would be you won't be using unless you're using your own computer to run the class, say if we went remote, it would look like this when you connect in the classroom. You'd click on it, it would download it, this would pop up. And then once it loads, you log in with your email and the password you created.
And this is what we tell students to log into at the beginning of class, every class?
Yes.
The
And
same app?
they'd use the same app. It would be the student one.
I know it's a different app. We use, I
Well,
tried downloading on my phone and they have iClicker for students, iClicker for instructors.
It would look the same. They would have the student version of the app. Okay, so now what I would do is I would click on start class for your other class. And that way, I'm not sure what that error message was, but it's working. So what happens is just as with the old iClicker, it pops up this little icon that floats on top of whatever you're doing. So if you do PowerPoint, Google Slides, Prezi, whatever you use for presentations, some people have even used Word where they type the questions right during a live class session, or Notepad. When you're ready to start the question, you would start the class and then students would connect to the class. So at the beginning of class, you tell students to log into this so they'll be ready to answer any questions when you start using it. And I usually do that right at the beginning. I'd start this before I put up any slides or open Zoom or anything else. And now to actually run a question, what you would do is you would click on that little cloud, the circle with the cloud image.
Before we proceed, John, I have this courses, window with my biochemistry class and the test class that I created. And below both, there is a join code. Do we need to enter anything?
That would be if you wanted to join the class from, or if you want to, why does it say join? That would be that would be the student view to join the class. Or maybe,
well, I'll just start this.
I had that option too. I ignored it.
I thought it was a start, but it says join. Okay, so I think that would be just to join that session, join that class session as the instructor. I thought it said start though, but I may be wrong. Maybe if you do it from the web, you could run it all from the web without the app, but the app is just a little bit more convenient. Because with the app, you get that little floating blue thing. So now once it's there and it's running, and that shows up as soon as you start the class or maybe join the class, click on that and it will give you the menu, and there's a menu. So you could start a poll. You could do a quiz if you have one saved. You just select it and activate it. You could do a roster to get people to join, but because we integrate with Blackboard, that will all be automatic. And then you just pick the type of question you're going to do, and then you would start the poll by clicking on the start symbol, the green. You could, if you click on more, you get other options, but now you pick which screen you're using or which window if you have multiple windows, and it'll default to this for later questions. Just choose select and that will display whatever. So for example, if you have a PowerPoint presentation, you could choose only to do that, or you could share your whole desktop, or if you have multiple screens, you'd have a list of those in case you wanted to go from one desktop to the other. And now it's waiting for people to respond. Students would then connect to this. They'd see the timer. They'd see the desktop with presumably the questions on it, and then they could vote on that. But because there's no one in this class, no one's going to respond. But that's what would happen.
So John, now is this a poll? This is a poll or a quiz?
This is a poll. If you want to do a quiz, you'd have to type it up in advance, save all the questions, and then on this menu, when you first open it, when you click on that blue circle, you would choose quiz and activate that specific quiz. And so, you'd have to, generally you'd create this in advance and then you'd start that quiz. So you'd have to create I'm pretty sure you'd have to create separately. I haven't done that, to be honest. So, but generally you'd use polling in class. The quiz is mostly used for asynchronous thing. If you're doing, for example, some type of a high flex course where some students are attending synchronously and some asynchronously, you could create a quiz for the asynchronous students that would be equivalent to the polling that you were doing in real time with the students attending synchronously. On the other hand, most people tend to use Blackboard for that. If you're going to give a quiz online, it's just as easy, and you got more power and more flexibility with a Blackboard quiz than you do with the quizzes from here. So that's why I have never used it, but it is an option that they added actually a few releases back. You could have done this with iClicker Cloud too, with iClicker Classic too. So what's different now is, well, a few things are different. One is if you go back to the poll again, there are more options. And if with the drop down, short answer is so people can type in responses. They could type in a sentence or so typically. Since most students will be working on mobile devices, you probably don't want them entering a paragraph or, a haiku even. But if you just want to get, a sentence from students, you'd use a short answer. Numeric responses only accept numbers. So if you have a problem where they have a solution, you could select that. A target response is one where there's an image and they touch the screen either by clicking on it with a mouse or touching it on their mobile device, and then it enters a response based on the position on the screen. Then when you grade the question, you choose a rectangle that selects where the correct responses are. If, again, you're grading them based on where they touch the screen. So if you had a map and you asked students to identify a particular state or the location of a particular city, you just draw, when you go to grade it within the app, you just drag a rectangle over the area where you want the correct answer to be, and that would automatically grade any responses within that rectangle as being correct. Or if you want, well, that probably isn't used as often, but it does offer some interesting possibilities for types of questions you didn't have before. Multiple answer is basically the multiple select that's available on Blackboard, where you can have more than one answer which is correct, and students can select any number of the answers as being correct or none of them, and they get graded proportionately based on how many correct responses they get, either by selecting or not selecting the appropriate options. And so that's it. Now, the other things you have available there is in the more option, you get the option of making any of the questions anonymous. So if you want students to respond anonymously so you can't see who submitted, and you wouldn't see that when you display it in class, but you could see it in the gradebook version of it. If you turn anonymous on, you'd only see the results. It wouldn't show up in the gradebook, and it wouldn't be tied to any individual. So if you're asking for some sensitive questions or something where your students might be more comfortable answering without, or if you're just getting some feedback on how the class is going, having them do a short answer anonymous is a good way to get students to say how their reactions to the class. I will often, periodically I'll ask students what's working well in the class and have them use an anonymous short answer. Or I'll say, what's not working so well? What could be changed to make the class more effective? And then a quick anonymous poll is a good way for you to get some quick feedback. And if you choose, you could display it or not. And one of the nice things within that feature, because there's no one in this class, we can't see it, but one of the options you have if you get the short answer response is there's a button you can click on the responses to generate a word cloud. So if you have a lot of class or a lot of students giving feedback about something, you could hit the word cloud option to see what words are showing up the most. And that's a nice way of making getting a quick and easy display in larger classes. You can change the timer count from being a count up to a count down if you want to while you're doing the poll. And you can also ask students to rate their confidence in responses, which is a really nice way of helping students, or to give students some feedback and us some feedback about whether there's any sort of Dunning-Kruger effect going on, whether students are very confident when they're wrong or whether they're more confident when they're right. And we could get a little bit of data on that. And students can also assess their understanding, and presumably it should help lead to improved metacognition about what students understand when you're asking, well, how confident are you in this answer? And then they get feedback and they either see they're right or they're wrong, which might allow them to better assess their own understanding. That's the main purpose of that option.
So do they get an extra question with each question, or?
So yes, they get two questions there. One is they answer it, and then it asks them to rate their confidence in that.
Okay, thanks.
Honestly, that's a new feature. It wasn't available in the fall, so I haven't tried it, but it looks like it might be interesting. So I'm assuming there has to be two questions, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do it. So it must be a two-stage process. So
I'm sorry, John. So after the polling is done when do we put in the correct answer? Is it after the question, or is it at the end of the class?
You have two times. You can either do it later, or you can do it at the end of the session. You can either do it while you're doing it or not. And what will happen is you get a histogram. If it's multiple choice and multiple select, it gives you a histogram of how many people clicked each option. And when you click on one, it will turn it green, and that flags it as being correct. If it's multiple select, you just click on all those that are correct, and it will turn all of them green and assign whatever points are appropriate. If it's a numeric response, then you would go through and click on. Here's where things get a little messy, depending on how many digits students enter. You know, if you ask them just to state pi, for example, some might say 3.14, some might say 3.141, et cetera, you know, and you'll have multiple responses there. And if you click on each, it will tell you the number of people that picked each one. You click on that one and it will turn it green, and it will give points, and you can scroll down through a whole list. If you ask students a free response question to ask for a term that describes something, you'll have to scroll through all the terms that people had and select each one that is correct as being a correct response, because often there'll be more than one potential way of expressing it, right? You know, if you ask students to, express it out to a certain number of decimal places, then you could be really strict on that and only count the one that has the appropriate number of decimal places in the response. But it will display all of them, and you select which ones are correct, either in real time while the results are displayed for the students, with the frequencies, or after you go to upload it. So when you finish with this, you can go into you do the synchronization with the gradebook. You first would synchronize your roster, very much like before, if you've used this before. And first, though, you want to go through select. Actually, Gwen, if you stop the sharing, I think I still have mine open, and I can show what it looks like from last semester. Yes, I need more time. I am here. Okay, so I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to hop over to my other screen for just a moment. And now you should see my other screen. These are when I've used mobile apps. Well, within this, last fall, I was using this version. And when I click on it, this is what it looks like at the end of the semester. Each day, you get a whole series of things. I had 136 participants. It was a 71.46 class average because it was marked correctly. But if I click on the session, and you'll get a new one for each session, from the first day will be session 1, session 2, and so forth. It will show you in each question. I had already selected, since these were uploaded, I already selected which ones were the correct answers, but it will show you what was on the screen at the time as before, and you just click on whichever one is correct. And again, I was using a system where they got 3 points for any answer, 5 points for correct answer. So option C was assigned 5 points. Options A, B, or D, or E were assigned 3 points. And once you do that for all of those, and it looks very similar if you do it right in real time on the screen, you will see the total. And then when you're finished, what you would do is, this one has been archived, so I'm not going to be able to synchronize it. But what would happen is when you click on it, you'd have the option of first synchronizing a roster, and then secondly, uploading the grades. When you do the roster sync, it will tell you that there are additional students who need to be added, and it will tell you if any students have dropped, and it will ask you if you want to remove those. Just the default options usually work pretty nicely there. And for students who have added the class but are not yet in there, it will give you that same option you had at the beginning of sending them an email with instructions on how to join. And typically for the first 2 or 3 weeks, you'll have to send out at least 1 or 2 of those to students who haven't quite connected yet, just as a reminder. And if you do that every class day, it generally gets your attention eventually. And sometimes separate emails to them will help.
So do we need to sync at the end of each class so they would see results on Blackboard, or is it automatic?
You need to do the synchronization. And the reason, just as before, you have to synchronize the grades because they want to make sure that you've actually selected which answers are correct. So it's only after the class ends when you go into the gradebook option and you actually synchronize it. Let me see.
Well, in my class, I provided.
Oops, I didn't want to do that
immediately so that they could see the feedback.
Yeah, but it will only synchronize after you do the upload. And I'll have to erase that from the recording because that actually had live student data from last semester. Sorry about that. But yeah, so when you synchronize it, it won't upload to Blackboard until it's done because it does a block data transfer. But they can see it in iClicker Cloud in real time. So if they go to their iClicker gradebook, they'll see all the scores as soon as they're marked as correct. And they'll have that record from the time you mark it as correct, whether it's done in real time during a polling session or after the class. So they'll really have two sets of scores, one in iClicker Cloud and one in Blackboard. But the Blackboard one is only when you do the sync. And that's pretty much like it was before, except it's a little bit better about identifying students who added or dropped than it used to be. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same.
Thanks a lot, John. I need to step out to meet with a student. I
Yeah,
appreciate your-
we're a little over time, but anyone, well, I'll stop the recording too. But does anyone have any other questions?
I really like all these updates and I like that it's for